Eastern Front, 1944. By the winter, German armor on the Eastern Front no longer advanced blindly into open ground, because experience had taught crews that survival depended on awareness, momentum, and coordination with infantry moving alongside them. Tanks pushed forward through ruined villages and frozen roads with engines idling low. Crews scanning constantly for anti-tank guns, mines, and groups of soldiers who looked capable of stopping them. What they watched for were obvious threats. What they did not always watch closely enough were individuals. In shelled-out villages, streets narrowed between collapsed buildings, rubble climbed halfway up doorways, and snow softened edges until everything looked the same at a glance. Smoke blurred distance, engines drowned out smaller sounds, and vision through periscopes reduced the battlefield to fragments instead of a whole picture. In that environment, size mattered more than detail. A tank commander scanning through a vision block looked for silhouettes of field guns, flashes of muzzle fire, or clusters of infantry moving with intent. A single soldier walking slowly rarely fit that picture, especially if he did not raise a weapon or move with urgency. Soviet doctrine had learned to exploit that. By 1943 and into 1944, Red Army infantry were trained to destroy tanks at point-blank range using explosives carried on the body rather than heavy crew-served weapons. The most common of these were the RPG-43 and the later RPG-6 anti-tank grenades, both designed around shaped charge technology rather than raw explosive force. The RPG-43 weighed just over 1 kilogram and used a shaped charge that focused its explosive energy into a narrow jet capable of penetrating roughly 75 millimeters of armor, which was enough to defeat the side or rear protection of a Panzer IV. The RPG-6 improved reliability and penetration, reaching close to 100 millimeters under favorable conditions, but it carried the same unforgiving requirement as its predecessor. The soldier had to get extremely close. Effective range for both grenades measured in meters, not tens of meters, which meant the man carrying one had to survive long enough to reach the side or rear of the tank without being cut down by machine gun fire or nearby infantry. German crews were aware of these weapons, but here's the problem. Awareness did not equal anticipation. Years of combat had trained them to fear guns, mines, and coordinated assaults, not individual soldiers who appeared to be out of the fight. That assumption shaped behavior. In narrow streets, tanks advanced with turrets oriented forward, machine guns scanning windows and intersections where resistance usually appeared. Infantry escorts moved ahead, clearing doorways and corners, convinced the ground behind them had already been dealt with. And that's when a lone infantryman stopped looking like a threat. Accounts from German after-action reports and Soviet frontline descriptions repeat the same pattern across dozens of engagements. A single Red Army soldier, sometimes wounded, sometimes deliberately slowing his movement, allowed a tank to approach, then moved alongside it without drawing fire. From inside the hull, he looked irrelevant. German tanks, such as the Panzer IV Ausf HH, still common in 1944, carried roughly 80 millimeters of frontal armor, which encouraged confidence when moving forward. The sides, rear, and engine deck were far thinner, filled with ventilation grills, fuel lines, and components that did not tolerate shaped charges well. Those areas were deadly weak points. Soviet training emphasized patience over speed in exploiting them. Infantry were taught not to rush armor, not to run, and not to raise suspicion. The goal was proximity, not heroics. That meant walking. A soldier who ran drew fire. A soldier who crouched looked dangerous. A soldier who walked calmly suggested defeat, retreat, or irrelevance, and that suggestion bought time. Once alongside the tank, the physics changed completely. Turret-mounted machine guns could not depress far enough to hit a man hugging the hull, and the main gun was useless at that distance. At that point, the crew depended entirely on infantry support to protect them. Too often, that support was gone. Infantry lagged behind, became distracted, or pushed ahead, and in village fighting coordination broke down faster than doctrine could correct it. A tank rolling forward without close escort created blind zones along its sides and rear, zones that could not be covered quickly enough once an attacker entered them. That was where the grenade mattered. The RPG-43 and RPG-6 had to be armed manually, the safety removed just before use, and thrown with enough force for stabilizing fins to deploy correctly. Soviet manuals instructed soldiers to aim for side armor or the engine deck, where penetration would stall the vehicle even if it did not destroy it outright. A stalled tank rarely survived long. German crews described the shock in blunt language. One moment the road felt clear, the next the engine stopped. Warning lights flashed, and smoke began filling the fighting compartment. Many never saw the man who threw the grenade. They only felt the impact. Engine failure turned armor into a liability. Fires spread rapidly in the rear compartment, fed by ruptured fuel lines and lubricants, and crew members scrambled for hatches before heat or ammunition finished the job. All of it traced back to the same misjudgment. The tank crew believed the lone soldier no longer mattered, believed danger came from groups rather than individuals, and believed the space around their vehicle had already been secured. Those beliefs collapsed the instant the grenade struck the hull. Soviet infantry losses did not end the practice, because, when the tactic worked, it worked decisively. By 1944, a growing share of German armor losses on the Eastern Front came from infantry weapons used at close range, not from opposing tanks. Mines, grenades, and point-blank assaults decided the fight far more often than steel-on-steel engagements. The tank that allowed a man to walk past it had already lost control of its surroundings. It just didn't know it yet. What followed happened fast, violent, and final, beginning the moment the grenade left the soldier's hand and struck the side of the vehicle. That was when the engine stopped. Eastern Front fighting in 1944 had produced experienced German tank crews. The men inside those tanks were not careless, not untrained, and not ignorant of danger, but they were operating on patterns that no longer matched the battlefield in front of them. Years of combat had taught German armor crews to identify threats by shape, scale, and behavior. Anti-tank guns announced themselves through muzzle flashes and recoil. Mines revealed their presence only once, but the aftermath trained crews where to expect them. Infantry assaults moved in groups, fast and deliberate, often supported by fire. Those patterns shaped instinct. Inside a Panzerwaffe, vision was narrow by design. The commander relied on periscopes and vision slits that showed slices of the street rather than the whole picture, which meant attention had to be prioritized or it became useless. In village fighting, rubble blocked lines of sight, smoke flattened depth, and constant engine noise reduced everything else to background sound. In that environment, tank crews learned to filter aggressively. They focused on rooftops, intersections, and windows, because that's where danger usually came from. They watched for movement that suggested coordination, because coordination was what killed tanks. Anything outside that framework faded into the background. A lone soldier walking slowly did exactly that. From inside the hull, he looked like someone already beaten, already bypassed, or already handled by infantry moving ahead. Especially if he carried no visible anti-tank weapon, his presence barely registered as a threat. And that's where the misjudgment took hold. German armor doctrine depended heavily on close infantry support. Infantry units were meant to screen tanks from close-range attacks, keep enemy soldiers at a distance, and eliminate exactly the kind of threat that later proved fatal. When coordination worked, close assault tactics failed quickly. But coordination rarely held in winter villages. Infantry fell behind in snow and rubble. Casualties broke formations. Streets forced separation. Noise swallowed shouted orders. Tanks pushed forward anyway, because stopping in narrow streets made them easy targets for heavier weapons. The result was a dangerous assumption. Tank crews believed infantry still covered their blind spots, and infantry believed tanks had already cleared the ground behind them. Between those beliefs sat a gap where no one was watching closely enough. The Soviet soldier walked straight through that gap. From the commander's perspective, attention remained fixed forward, where resistance was expected to appear. Turret movement stayed steady, scanning for guns rather than individuals. Hull and coaxial machine guns covered arcs, not the space pressed directly against the side armor. Once proximity was allowed, options collapsed. At arm's length, the main gun could not engage. Machine guns could not depress far enough. Turret traverse could not compensate quickly enough for a threat already touching the hull. Reaction time mattered, and reaction time had already been spent elsewhere. German after-action reports described the result with striking consistency. Tanks halted without warning. Engines stalled. Smoke filled the compartment. Crews bailed out under fire, often without ever seeing the attacker. The misjudgment happened before any of that. It happened when the soldier was allowed to get close because he did not look like danger. Soviet infantry training counted on this human weakness. Manuals emphasized reading enemy behavior rather than charging blindly, teaching soldiers to wait until tank crews relaxed. Infantry drifted forward, and attention shifted away from the hull itself. Patience mattered more than speed. Every instinct told a man to move away from armor, not toward it, but discipline made the difference. Standing calmly beside a tank took control that only experience could produce, and that control often lasted just long enough. Fatigue made the problem worse. By 1944, German crews were exhausted, operating under constant pressure with shrinking margins for error. Surviving one engagement reinforced habits that worked last time, even when the conditions had changed. Success bred routine. Routine bred assumptions, and assumptions killed tanks. The crew that let him walk past did not believe they were making a mistake. They believed they were operating inside familiar rules, rules that had once kept them alive. By the time those rules failed, the engine was already dying, smoke was already rising, and escape was already a gamble. The next moments would not be about doctrine or experience. They would be about survival. Getting within arm's reach of a German tank in 1944 did not happen by accident, and it never happened quickly. It was the result of terrain, timing, and discipline lining up in a way that erased the distance tanks were supposed to keep between themselves and enemy infantry. On the Eastern Front, villages became traps for armor. Streets narrowed between collapsed stone buildings, debris blocked side routes, and snow filled shell holes until ground and rubble blended together. Tanks were forced to slow down, sometimes to a crawl, because speed in those conditions meant throwing tracks or exposing the hull to heavier weapons. That slowdown changed everything. A slow-moving tank became predictable. The engine noise stayed constant. The turret tracked forward instead of sweeping constantly. And the crew's attention locked onto the next intersection or the next line of buildings where resistance was expected to appear. The Soviet soldier was already there before the tank arrived. He had not chased it, and he had not rushed into its path. He had taken cover earlier, pinned by fire or pressed flat against rubble, while German infantry cleared ahead of the armor. When the shooting moved forward and attention followed it, he stayed exactly where he was. Stillness kept him alive. German infantry passed him without stopping, stepping around bodies, debris, and anything else that no longer registered as a threat. In the noise and confusion of winter combat, a man who was not moving aggressively became part of the background. The tank followed its escort. From the commander's position inside the hull, the scene looked controlled. Infantry were ahead, clearing the way. No anti-tank guns were visible. No organized resistance appeared in windows or doorways. The street felt secured enough to keep moving. That perception was wrong, but it was convincing. As the tank rolled forward, its bulk filled the street, steel sides inches from stone walls. Exhaust poured from the rear deck, heat rising into cold air, and the sound of the engine swallowed everything else. Communication inside the tank was already strained by vibration and noise, and outside, voices barely registered at all. The Soviet soldier waited until the tank was alongside him, not ahead of him and not behind him, beside it. At that distance, the tank's weapons lost their advantage. Turret-mounted machine guns could not depress far enough to cover the space tight against the hull. The main gun was useless, pointing forward at targets that no longer mattered. This was the blind zone. He stepped out deliberately. Not running, because running triggered reflexive fire. Not crouching, because crouching suggested attack. He walked. Walking signaled defeat or irrelevance, and that signal bought seconds. The tank commander saw him briefly through a vision block, just long enough to register a human shape near the hull. And then the soldier disappeared from view as the tank continued forward. The commander's attention shifted back to the street ahead, where real threats were expected. The tank did not stop. The Soviet soldier matched its pace, staying close enough that the hull shielded him from infantry fire on the far side of the street. German infantry were already moving ahead, focused on the next block, convinced the ground behind them had been cleared. No one was watching him anymore. Training manuals described this moment clinically, but living inside it was something else entirely. The heat from the engine radiated through steel and into the body. The vibration of the tracks traveled up through boots and legs. The smell of fuel, oil, and exhaust filled the air so completely that breathing felt heavy. Every step mattered. One misstep meant falling under the tracks or drawing fire from infantry who would react instantly if they noticed movement. Every second beside the tank increased the risk, but stepping away increased it more. He stayed tight to the hull. German tanks, such as the Panzer IV, vented engine heat through grills on the rear deck, an area thinner and more vulnerable than the frontal armor. Fuel lines, cooling systems, and lubricants were packed beneath those plates, and damage there spread fast. That was the target. The Soviet soldier waited until the rear of the tank came into reach, until he could feel the heat rising from the engine deck and hear the change in exhaust note as the vehicle strained against debris. Only then did his hand move. The RPG-43 grenade came free at the last possible moment. Its weight was familiar, its balance memorized through repetition, and the arming sequence had been drilled until it no longer required conscious thought. One hand removed the safety cap. The other steadied the throw. The grenade had to be thrown correctly. If it struck at the wrong angle, the shaped charge would not focus properly, and the result could be survivable for the tank. Soviet training emphasized placement over force, aiming for side armor or the engine deck rather than frontal plates that could absorb the blast. The tank rolled forward, unaware. German infantry were already several meters ahead, focused outward, scanning windows and intersections where resistance usually appeared. No one had reason to look back at a space they believed was already secure. The moment arrived without drama. The grenade left his hand and struck the side of the tank near the rear deck, the stabilizing fins deploying just before impact. The detonation followed almost immediately, the shaped charge collapsing inward and driving a jet of molten metal through steel into the engine compartment. The effect was decisive. Fuel lines ruptured, oil ignited, mechanical systems seized or stalled under sudden damage. Inside the tank, warning lights flared, heat surged, and smoke began pushing forward through seams and hatches. The engine stopped. From the outside, it looked like the tank had simply died in place, tracks grinding for a fraction of a second before going still. From the inside, it felt like the world had tipped sideways. The Soviet soldier did not stay to watch. Close assault infantry survived by leaving immediately after the attack, because the moment a tank stopped, attention snapped back to the space around it. Staying meant becoming the next target. He moved away from the hull as the first hatch flew open, and a crewman tried to climb out, face already blackened by smoke and oil. Gunfire erupted seconds later. German infantry reacting too late, firing toward a space that was already empty. By the time they understood what had happened, the damage was done. The tank was no longer a weapon. The advance had lost its anchor. Momentum was gone. All of it traced back to the same sequence. A tank slowed by terrain. A soldier who stayed still. A crew that looked forward instead of sideways. That was how he got close enough. And once he did, distance stopped protecting steel. The grenade did not succeed because German armor was poorly designed, and it did not succeed because the tank crew lacked training. The failure happened earlier, in the assumptions that shaped how the tank moved through that street and how its crew judged what mattered around them. Inside the Panzer IV, the crew believed the space around the vehicle was already controlled, and that belief guided every decision that followed. Infantry had moved ahead, firing had shifted forward, and no obvious anti-tank weapons had revealed themselves. From the commander's view, the dangerous part of the street was already behind them. That confidence showed in small, telling ways. The tank continued forward, instead of halting to recheck its flanks. The turret stayed oriented down the street instead of sweeping side to side. And infantry support drifted farther ahead instead of remaining tight to the hull. Each of those choices made sense on its own, but together they created a gap no one was watching. That gap was fatal. German doctrine stressed combined arms for a reason. Tanks were never meant to operate without infantry close enough to protect their blind zones, especially in villages where rubble and walls erased long sight lines. When that coordination held, close assault attacks failed quickly, often violently. Winter fighting made that coordination fragile. Snow slowed infantry and broke formations, rubble forced detours, casualties thinned squads, and constant noise swallowed shouted commands. Tanks pushed forward anyway, because stopping in narrow streets made them vulnerable to heavier weapons and artillery. The result was a dangerous assumption. Tank crews believed infantry still covered their sides and rear, and infantry believed the tank had already secured the ground behind them. Between those beliefs sat a stretch of space where no one was paying full attention. The Soviet soldier moved through that space without resistance. From the crew's perspective, he did not fit the profile of danger. He was not part of a group, he carried no visible anti-tank weapon, and he did not move with urgency. His posture suggested retreat, confusion, or irrelevance, and that suggestion delayed reaction just long enough. Once proximity was allowed, the tank's advantages disappeared. At arm's length, the main gun could not engage. Turret-mounted machine guns could not depress far enough, and hull guns covered arcs that no longer mattered. Reaction time became the only defense, and reaction time had already been spent watching the wrong direction. German after-action reports described this sequence repeatedly: tanks halting without warning, engines failing, smoke filling the compartment, and crews bailing out under fire without ever seeing the attacker. The damage always appeared sudden, but the mistake had been made seconds earlier. It happened when the soldier was allowed to get close. Soviet training relied on this human weakness. Infantry were taught to read posture rather than firepower, to wait until crews relaxed. Infantry drifted forward, and attention shifted away from the hull itself. The goal was not speed or aggression, but timing. Patience mattered more than bravery. Every instinct told a man to move away from armor, not toward it. Yet discipline overrode instinct just long enough. Standing calmly beside a tank required control that only experience produced, and that control often lasted only seconds. Fatigue made the error repeat. By 1944, German crews were exhausted, operating under constant pressure with little margin for recovery. Surviving one engagement reinforced habits that had worked before, even when conditions had changed. Routine replaced caution, and routine dulled awareness. The crew that let him walk past did not think they were making a mistake. They believed they were operating inside rules that had kept them alive for years. Those rules failed the moment the grenade struck the hull. Smoke rose, heat surged, and the engine began to die. But by then, correction was impossible. The mistake had already done its work, and the tank was already lost. The moment the grenade struck the tank, the change inside the vehicle was immediate and unmistakable, even before sound fully caught up with force. There was no dramatic fireball at first, no outward spectacle that announced what had happened, only a heavy concussive jolt that traveled through steel, mounts, and machinery as if the tank itself had been hit with a massive hammer. Inside the Panzer IV, the crew felt it through their bodies. The engine note changed instantly, dropping from a steady mechanical roar into something uneven and wrong. A grinding, choking sound that lasted only a second before cutting out completely. Warning lights flared across the interior panels. Heat surged from the rear compartment, and smoke began seeping forward through seams that were never meant to carry it. The tank lurched forward less than a meter, tracks scraping uselessly against stone, and then it stopped. For the crew, that stop carried meaning far beyond mobility. A tank that could not move in close terrain was no longer armor. It was a fixed target, a steel box that drew fire and trapped the men inside it. Outside, the change registered just as clearly. The engine noise vanished, replaced by an unnatural quiet that stood out in a street still filled with battle sounds. German infantry nearby turned instinctively toward the tank, trying to understand why it had halted in a place where it should have continued forward. For a few seconds, confusion replaced momentum. Those seconds mattered. The Soviet soldier did not stay beside the hull to confirm the damage, because close assault infantry survived by leaving immediately after the attack. The moment a tank stopped, attention snapped back to the space around it, and anyone still there became the next target. He moved away from the hull as the first hatch flew open. A crewman pushed himself out into the cold air, face already darkened with oil and smoke, eyes wide as he tried to orient himself under fire. Gunshots cracked almost immediately. German infantry reacting late, firing toward the rear of the tank, where they believed the attacker still was. They were already behind the moment. Inside the fighting compartment, conditions deteriorated fast. Flames licked through the engine bay, fed by ruptured fuel lines and lubricants, and smoke thickened into something that burned the lungs with every breath. Crew members shouted over each other, voices muffled by helmets and noise, trying to execute emergency drills that suddenly felt far too slow. Staying inside meant burning. Leaving meant running through gunfire. There was no good option left. Another crewman climbed out seconds later, movements clumsy from concussion and lack of air, dropping from the hull into a street that no longer belonged to German armor. Whether he survived depended on distance, cover, and luck, not on training or courage. The tank itself became a magnet. A disabled vehicle in close terrain drew attention like nothing else on the battlefield. Soviet infantry, seeing smoke and the sudden halt, shifted fire immediately, rifles and machine guns redirecting toward the wreck. The stopped Panzer IV marked the exact point where German control ended, and uncertainty began. Infantry tried to respond, but the rhythm was gone. An advance that had been moving forward with confidence now stalled. Bodies bunching up around a wreck they could not ignore, but could no longer use. Streets that had funneled movement efficiently moments earlier now trapped men in the open, offering little cover and no clear direction. All of it traced back to a decision already made. The tank had been allowed to pass without being questioned. A soldier had been allowed to walk beside it, and the assumption that the ground was secure had gone unchallenged. Within less than a minute of the grenade's impact, the Panzer IV ceased to exist as a fighting vehicle. Smoke poured from the rear deck, flames climbed higher, and sharp cracks echoed from inside the hull as ammunition began to cook off under rising heat. German infantry pulled back instinctively, creating distance before the tank detonated fully. No order was needed for that. Experience taught every soldier what burning armor eventually did. The street emptied around the wreck. The Soviet soldier was already gone. He disappeared into rubble and snow the same way he had appeared, leaving behind no clear target, no visible trail, only the proof of what had happened. A tank that had dominated the street seconds earlier now sat dead, blocking movement and drawing fire. That single loss reshaped the fight immediately. Without the tank, the infantry advance lost its anchor. Without momentum, coordination failed. Units hesitated, leaders reassessed, and every assumption about control had to be reconsidered under fire. Armor was supposed to provide certainty. A stopped tank did the opposite. For German troops on the ground, the psychological impact cut deep. Tanks were not just weapons, they were reassurance, moving shields that suggested progress and protection. When one died suddenly and without warning, confidence evaporated with it. The men who saw it happen did not need explanations. They understood what it meant. One soldier had reached the tank. One grenade had done its work. And everything that followed spiraled outward from that point. On the Eastern Front, this pattern repeated itself again and again, not because crews were foolish, but because the conditions that allowed it never truly changed. Villages stayed narrow, snow stayed deep, infantry stayed exhausted, and the battlefield punished anyone who relied too heavily on assumptions. The engine stopping was not the end of the fight. It was the signal that the fight had shifted. Steel had lost its advantage, and the ground now belonged to the men who knew how to wait, move, and strike when attention drifted elsewhere. By the time German forces reorganized and tried to push forward again, the opportunity was gone. The street that had looked secure moments earlier had turned hostile, shaped by rubble, fire, and a wreck that could not be ignored. One machine had died. and with it, the belief that a single soldier no longer mattered. When the fire finally settled into a steady burn, the street felt altered in a way that everyone present understood without needing words. The Panzer IV sat motionless in the center of the road, smoke rising straight up from the rear deck, black against the pale winter sky, a dead machine marking the exact point where the advance had failed. German infantry instinctively pulled farther back. No one needed orders to do that. Years of experience taught every soldier the same lesson about burning armor. Ammunition cooked off without warning, metal fragments flew unpredictably, and staying close to a disabled tank rarely ended well. Distance was survival. What remained around the wreck was hesitation. Moments earlier, the street had belonged to German armor, infantry moving with confidence behind steel that promised protection. Now that confidence was gone. The tank no longer moved, no longer covered angles, and no longer absorbed attention. Instead, it drew fire and uncertainty in equal measure. Soviet infantry recognized the shift immediately. Rifles appeared in windows that had been passed without a second glance. Machine guns opened from rubble piles that had gone unnoticed. Fire began to converge on the space around the wreck, not because orders had been given, but because instinct told men where the balance had tipped. The street no longer felt safe. The soldier who had thrown the grenade was already far from the wreck by then, moving the way Soviet close assault infantry were trained to move after a successful attack. He did not watch the tank burn, did not wait to see who escaped, and did not linger for confirmation. Staying meant dying. He blended back into the terrain that had hidden him before, rubble and snow swallowing his movement, until he was indistinguishable from every other shape in the ruined village. In most cases like this, no one ever identified the individual responsible, not during the fight and not afterward. Reports would mention a tank disabled by infantry action. Names rarely appeared. On the German side, the loss went into paperwork as another vehicle destroyed or abandoned, another gap in an already shrinking armored force. On the Soviet side, it became one more example passed quietly between soldiers, proof that patience and proximity could still defeat steel. The wreck itself stayed where it was. Burned-out tanks were often bypassed rather than recovered, left behind as the front shifted again. Roads changed, villages changed hands, and what had been a focal point of violence became just another obstacle to move around. For the men who saw it happen, though, the image stayed sharp. A tank rolling forward, a soldier walking beside it. No alarm, no reaction. Then the engine stopped. That sequence mattered more than numbers or firepower, because it captured something the Eastern Front taught relentlessly. Control was fragile, assumptions were dangerous, and even the most powerful weapons failed when attention drifted. German crews adapted where they could, tightening infantry screens and reacting more aggressively to lone figures near their vehicles. Even so, fatigue, terrain, and pressure made perfection impossible. The same conditions repeated themselves again and again, and so did the outcome. Villages stayed narrow. Snow stayed deep. Fighting stayed close. And lone soldiers kept being underestimated. The stopped tank was not an isolated incident, and it was not unique. It was part of a pattern that defined the later years of the war in the East, where armor died less often in duels with other tanks, and more often in moments where discipline, patience, and timing overcame steel. The aftermath rarely looked dramatic. There were no cheers, no speeches, no pause in the fighting. The war moved on, indifferent to the wreck left behind. But the lesson endured, passed quietly from crew to crew, and from infantryman to infantryman, shaping behavior in ways that never made it into official doctrine. A tank was only safe when the space around it was controlled, and control vanished the moment someone stopped paying attention. They let him walk past the tank. And by the time they understood what that meant, the street no longer belonged to them. If you want more stories like this, moments where one overlooked detail collapsed an entire advance, subscribe now. These aren't legends or movie scenes. They're real combat patterns pulled straight from World War II. And there are many more like this that almost never get told.